The moment Emma locked the front door of the little diner for the last time, her hands still trembling from the manager's cold words about her being too friendly with customers, she thought it was over. Her kindness, her smile, her genuine care for the lonely old man in booth 5 had cost her everything. But what she didn't know was that man, the one she'd brought extra pie to and remembered by name, was not just a customer. He was Henry Langford, a reclusive real estate mogul worth billions. And the very next morning, as she packed boxes in her tiny apartment, he walked into that same diner with a lawyer, a briefcase, and one sentence that would change her life forever. The lights in the diner were already dimmed, casting long, tired shadows across the cracked vinyl booths and the scuffed linoleum floor that had seen decades of silent heartbreak and small talk over lukewarm coffee. The friar's buzz hummed like a final warning, echoing through the quiet tension that always followed the dinner rush. Emma wiped down the last table with practiced grace, her tired smile still holding for the sake of routine, her apron stained with the evidence of another 10-hour shift. She moved like a woman used to being overlooked, but unwilling to let that harden her. Her kindness had always been her armor, her language, her gift. That night, just as she was grabbing her bag from the back room, Rita, the manager with sharp heels and sharper judgment, called her aside with that clipped tone she reserved for bad news she did not want to repeat. Rita's lips pursed like she had tasted something bitter and now had to spit it out. She looked at Emma, not with malice but with the detachment of a woman who had already decided. You make customers too comfortable. This is a business, not therapy. That was it. No warning. No written complaint, just that cruel dismissal delivered with a kind of finality that made Emma's stomach drop. Her first reaction was confusion, followed by the slow rolling wave of shame. Her hands, which had just minutes ago cradled a customer's hand as he talked about his late wife, now hung useless by her sides. The warmth that had always filled her chest when someone smiled back at her across a booth now curdled into humiliation. She had done nothing wrong except care too much. She had remembered birthdays. She had paid for meals when someone came up short. She had held space for loneliness in a world that rushed past it, and now that was a fireable offense. Her voice caught in her throat when she tried to ask for a reason beyond that vague accusation. Rita only shrugged and pointed to the clipboard with her final paycheck, clipped to it like a verdict. The smell of grease and bleach hung in the air like the final insult. Emma took the envelope and walked through the empty dining room for what she thought was the last time. The booths looked different now, like strangers. Booth 5, in particular, a small corner where she had spent an extra moment refilling a lonely old man's coffee just hours earlier, now felt like the scene of some forgotten kindness that no one would remember but her. She stepped into the cold night air with a weight in her chest and the metallic taste of failure on her tongue, fired for being too friendly. The absurdity stung even as it echoed back at her. Somewhere behind her, the lights flickered off. The diner was closed. So was the door she had built a life around. And as she walked into the dark, she had no idea that someone was still sitting at booth 5, watching it all unfold. The hum of the fluorescent light above booth 5 buzzed with the low persistence of an old world refusing to fade. It flickered every few minutes like a faulty heartbeat and cast a pale glow over the formica table where Henry sat, his coffee long gone cold and untouched. He had been coming to this diner for weeks, always at the same time, always alone, always quiet, dressed in a worn navy sweater with elbows thinned by time and travel. He blended in like wallpaper. But his eyes missed nothing. They were sharp and grey, the kind of eyes that had once seen far more than menus and check slips. On this night, he watched as Emma moved through the dining room with her usual lightness, offering a tired smile to the last lingering customer, her steps practiced and precise. She had brought him pie without asking. Apple. Said it reminded her of autumn in Vermont, though he had never mentioned a word about his own preferences. He had smiled at that, a real smile, the kind that felt like a memory. Then something shifted. Henry saw Rita stop Emma with a hand on her shoulder. The exchange was brief, low in volume, but it carried a weight that was immediately visible in Emma's posture. Her back straightened first, then slumped. Her hands clutched her apron, and then she turned and walked toward the exit, not saying goodbye, not looking back. Her face was tight with the effort of not breaking down in the middle of a place she had clearly given so much of herself to. Henry watched it all unfold with growing unease, his brow furrowing beneath white strands of neatly combed hair. When the door closed behind her, the small bell above it gave one final jingle like a punctuation mark on something unjust. Henry raised his hand slightly, signaling a passing busser. A teenager chewing gum with headphones around his neck approached. Henry's voice was low but firm. "The girl, where did she go?" The busser shrugged with indifference. "Said she was fired or something." "Too friendly, whatever that means." Then he wandered off toward the kitchen without a second thought. Henry sat in stillness for a moment longer, staring at the empty space Emma had just left behind. The corner of his mouth twitched, not with anger, with something heavier, regret, maybe guilt. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook, aged and bound with a simple brass clasp. He flipped it open to a half-filled page and made a single notation. The pen scratched softly as he wrote 2 lines in small, careful print. "Emma, fired. Too kind." Then he closed the book, placed it gently back into his pocket, and looked out the window as the streetlights caught raindrops on the glass. His reflection stared back at him. Harder, older, but resolute. Henry Langford had been mistaken for a harmless old man in booth 5. But he was no passive observer. Not anymore. The apartment was small in the way that made silence louder, the kind of place where even the ticking of the wall clock felt intrusive, and every sound had nowhere to hide. The kitchen sink was full of dishes she had meant to do the night before, the cheap faucet dripping a slow and uneven rhythm that echoed in the otherwise still room. Her apron hung over the back of the only chair in the kitchen, stained with ketchup and coffee, now looking more like a memory than a piece of clothing. Emma sat on the edge of her twin mattress, her hands pressed against her forehead, her elbows balanced on trembling knees. The room smelled faintly of lavender dryer sheets and microwaved noodles, an unglamorous scent that matched the flat lighting of the single ceiling bulb above her. She had not changed out of her uniform yet. The fabric clung to her like a second skin she couldn't peel off. Her phone lay beside her on the mattress, screen cracked in the corner, blinking softly with a missed call from a temp agency she had not heard from in weeks. She ignored it and instead opened her call list, her thumb hovering for a moment before tapping the name labeled Abby. The phone rang twice before her sister picked up, cheerful and unsuspecting. But Emma could not return the tone. Her breath hitched before words did, and her voice came out small, brittle. "I was kind. That's all I did. I listened." Her throat closed around the rest. Abby was quiet on the other end, letting the silence speak first. Emma tried again, her voice steadier but soaked in disbelief. "I treated people like they mattered, and for that I got fired." Her fingers dug into the blanket, pulling at loose threads like they might hold the answers. The emotion behind her words cracked open something inside her. The manager's cold eyes, the clipboard, the walk out. It all looped in her mind like a punishment. She thought of the man in booth 5, the one who looked at her like she wasn't invisible, the only one who might have noticed. But even that felt absurd now. Who was she to think kindness could matter? In a world where time was money and everything had to be fast and efficient, she had dared to slow down, to ask people how they were really doing, to remember names and pain and stories, and now that soft rebellion had cost her everything. The rent was due in 5 days. Her tips were gone. Her pride was bruised. Emma buried her face in her hands as the tears finally came. Not the pretty kind, the shaking kind, the gasping kind that took her breath and left her aching. She let them fall in the dimness of her tiny one-bedroom, surrounded by dishes she couldn't clean and silence that no longer comforted. There was no one to fight for her, no one who saw her. Or so she believed. The apartment was barely larger than the diner's kitchen, a cramped one-bedroom that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now pressed in on Emma like a shrinking box. The walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through, a low buzz of some late-night show laughing at nothing. The dishes from breakfast and lunch were still piled in the sink, crusted with the stubborn remains of eggs and toast, forgotten in the rush of a shift she never finished. Her apron hung over the back of the only chair in the corner, still damp from the rain she had walked through to get home, the edges stiff where ketchup had dried into the fabric. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, not under the covers but above them, jacket still on, hair pulled back like she was still on the clock. The overhead bulb gave off a harsh, unforgiving light that made everything look older and more tired, including her. She stared at her phone on the blanket, willing it to ring, hoping it might bring some impossible answer. Instead, she picked it up and tapped her sister's name. Abby answered quickly, her voice warm and full of the kind of energy Emma couldn't find in herself. But Emma couldn't keep it together long enough to return the greeting. Her breath shuddered out of her, shaky and uneven, and the words came through the tears she had tried all evening to hold back. "I was kind. That's all I did. I listened." The silence on the other end said more than any words. Emma wiped her nose with her sleeve, embarrassed by her own voice. "They said I made people too comfortable, that I was too friendly, that it wasn't professional." Her hands curled into fists in her lap, not in anger, but in helplessness. She had spent years in that diner, learning the rhythm of people's grief and loneliness. She had known when someone needed a refill, and when they needed a moment to cry in peace. She had remembered birthdays, and listened to war stories, and watched regulars fade from life slowly over coffee cups. And none of it had saved her. She whispered into the phone, "I gave everything to that place, and they just let me go. No warning, no thank you, just gone." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Abby's soft reassurance came through the speaker, but it couldn't reach the place inside Emma that had gone quiet. She looked at the wall across from her bed, the old paint peeling in the corner, the calendar with days already crossed off, as though time itself had moved on without asking. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of her damp coat and the faintest scent of burnt toast. In that small, tired room, Emma let the truth settle on her chest like weight she could not lift, fired for being too kind. In a world that felt colder every day, her warmth had been labeled a flaw, and for the first time in a long time, she began to wonder if maybe it was. The rain had painted the windows in streaks of grey that blurred the outside world into something distant and unbothered, and inside the diner that Tuesday afternoon, the silence stretched long and easy. Only 2 booths were occupied, and the radio played something old and soft that no one paid attention to. The usual clangs and clatters of lunch hour were gone, replaced by the slow drip of coffee into thick ceramic mugs and the occasional squeak of a sneaker on the tile floor. Emma moved through it all like part of the atmosphere, humming under her breath as she wiped down the counters, her damp curls frizzing at the edges from the walk-in. Her shoes squelched a little with each step, but she didn't seem to mind. She had always loved the quiet after rain, how it made people slow down just enough to see each other. That was the first day she noticed the man in booth 5, sitting alone with a steaming mug and a leather-bound book that looked older than the jukebox in the corner. He had a stillness about him, a kind of watchfulness that didn't ask to be noticed, but Emma noticed anyway. He wore a wool sweater that had seen better winters and a gold watch on his wrist, the kind with no digital face, just slender hands that ticked with quiet dignity. When she approached with the coffee pot, he didn't look up at first. Then she set down a slice of apple pie in front of him without a word, still warm, the crust crumbling at the edges just the way she liked it. "No charge," she said softly, and when he raised his eyes to meet hers, they were sharp and tired all at once. She smiled anyway and nodded toward the watch. "My grandfather had one just like it." "You wind it every morning?" The question hung in the air like something fragile. He looked down at his wrist and then back up at her, a faint smile lifting the corners of his mouth, like she had unlocked a small part of him he thought no one could see anymore. He gave a single nod. She didn't ask more. She just topped off his coffee, slid the pie closer, and said, "Pie's better after the rain. Don't ask me why. It just is." Then she walked away, not expecting a thank you. But from his booth, Henry Langford watched her go, his fingers resting lightly on the watch face as if it had just spoken. It wasn't the pie or the gesture. It was that she had looked at him and seen something human, not just a seat to fill or a check to close. She had spoken about time not like it was running out, but like it was worth winding up again. And in that moment, for reasons he couldn't name, Henry remembered her. The morning light slipped through the slats of the blinds in fractured beams, casting pale stripes across the chipped table where Emma sat hunched over a steaming mug of instant coffee. She wore the same pajamas she had fallen asleep in, an old college sweatshirt and mismatched flannel pants, the fabric pilled from years of use. Her hair was a tangled mess pulled into a lopsided knot, and her eyes were still puffy from the night before, when sleep had come in short, broken waves. The air in the apartment was heavy with quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of traffic outside. Her phone lay face down next to her elbow, ignored until it buzzed sharply across the table, making her jump. She flipped it over, expecting spam or silence, but froze when she saw the caller ID. Rita. For a full beat she just stared at the screen, unsure if she had the energy to answer, unsure if she wanted to hear more of the same clipped detachment from the woman who had taken her job like it was nothing. But something in her gut told her to pick up. She swiped and lifted the phone to her ear, her voice still rough from sleep. "Hello." Rita's voice came through immediately, but not in the tone Emma expected. It was trembling, not with anger but with confusion, almost disbelief. "Emma, listen, you're not going to believe this." Her words came out in a rush, like she was still trying to process what she was saying. "That man, the one from booth 5, he came in this morning, said he wanted to buy the diner, and he did, cash. Just like that." Emma blinked, not sure she had heard correctly. Her spoon paused mid-stir. "Bought the diner." The words didn't make sense, but Rita wasn't finished. "And he asked for you. By name. Said you were the reason. Said he wanted to speak with you." Emma sat in stunned silence, her heart thudding in her chest like a slow drum. Her first instinct was to laugh, to assume it was some cruel joke. But Rita wasn't joking. Her voice was too unsteady, too bewildered. "He left his number. Said to call him." Emma placed the mug down slowly, her hands suddenly unsteady. The man from booth 5, quiet, polite, always alone. She remembered the pie, the watch, the way he had looked at her like she wasn't invisible. And now, this. The idea felt absurd and impossible. But beneath the confusion, something stirred. A flicker of heat in the cold ashes of last night's despair. Hope, small, fragile, but real. She leaned back in her chair, phone still pressed to her ear, as her mind tried to catch up with her racing pulse. Rita was still talking, still trying to make sense of it. But Emma had already stood up, the world tilting just slightly around her. The story wasn't over. Not yet. Something was beginning. The afternoon light poured through the dusty blinds in slanted gold lines that painted the vinyl seats of booth 5 with warmth and memory, the same booth where she had once served him pie without a price tag and asked about his old watch like it meant something. Now Emma sat across from Henry, her hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug that had gone lukewarm but still offered some kind of anchor, something solid to hold on to as the rest of her spun quietly out of place. The diner around them looked no different than it had last week, but nothing felt the same. The tables were empty, the jukebox silent, and the air carried a different kind of charge, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Henry sat calmly, hands folded, sweater sleeves pushed up just slightly as though he had work to do. His face, lined with years and quiet wisdom, gave away nothing, but his eyes were clear and steady. He didn't look at her like a waitress anymore. He looked at her like a decision. After a moment of stillness, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate, each word placed like a brick. "I don't want you as a waitress. I want you to help me rebuild this place." The words landed with weight, not harsh, not heavy, but certain. Emma blinked, unsure if she had heard right. Her fingers tightened around the mug until her knuckles paled, and her mind rushed to fill the silence with reasons to say no. She was not qualified. She had no degree, no business plan, no authority. She was just the girl who remembered people's coffee orders and brought extra napkins without being asked. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her throat felt tight. This place had let her go like she was disposable, forgettable, and now the man who had seen her in her most invisible moment was offering her something that didn't even make sense. Rebuild it. How? Why? What did he see in her that no one else had bothered to look for? Henry watched her reaction without pressure. His offer wasn't a command, it was an invitation, and beneath the fear that rose in her chest like a wave, there was something else, wonder, the kind she hadn't felt in years, a quiet flicker of belief, barely lit but stubborn enough to glow. Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? What would that even look like?" Henry smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth turning upward like he had already imagined it. Different, warmer, human. This place has soul. It just needed someone to see it. Emma looked down at her trembling hands, the same hands that had wiped tears from lonely old men and cleaned spilled milkshakes from under tables without complaint. Maybe they were capable of building something more. Maybe this wasn't just a job offer. Maybe it was a chance to rewrite what she believed about herself. And maybe, just maybe, she could say yes. The glow of Emma's laptop cast a soft blue light across her small kitchen table, where the crumbs of a half-eaten muffin sat untouched beside her elbow. Her friend Janelle sat across from her, one leg pulled up under the other, scrolling through her phone with a growing look of disbelief hardening into awe. The two of them had spent the last hour trying to understand who Henry Langford really was, because Emma's mind could not make peace with the idea that the quiet man in the worn sweater, who had once thanked her with a simple nod for pie on a rainy day, now owned the diner she had been fired from. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. Until Janelle gasped and turned her phone toward Emma without a word. There, frozen in glossy color, was a decades-old Forbes magazine cover. The headline read, "Henry Langford, the man who built a kingdom from a key card." The image showed a younger version of the same man who now sipped coffee at booth 5. His face smoother, his eyes just as sharp, standing in front of a glass tower that bore his name. Emma leaned in closer, her heart ticking faster with every word she read. Henry Langford was not just a retired businessman. He had been one of the most influential hoteliers in the world. He had pioneered boutique hospitality before it had even become a trend, opening elegant, minimalist hotels across 5 continents, known for their warmth and detail. But what stunned Emma most was the second paragraph. After his wife's sudden death from a rare illness, Henry sold off most of his assets, disappeared from the public eye, and had not been seen or heard from in nearly 20 years. It was as if grief had swallowed him whole and left nothing behind but shadows and whispers. Emma sat back in her chair, her arms folded tightly across her chest, the weight of this new truth settling on her shoulders like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The man she had seen as lonely, as quiet, as gentle, had once held the power to shape skylines and industries. Why would someone like that come to her diner? Why would someone like that see something in her? Janelle's voice broke through the silence. "Girl, you understand this man is a legend. People used to call him the architect of belonging." Emma looked down at her hands, remembering how they had trembled when he offered her the chance to rebuild the diner. Suddenly, it didn't feel like a simple gesture anymore. It felt intentional, like he had been waiting for someone real, someone kind, someone like her. And as awe rippled into curiosity and then bled into doubt, Emma realized this story was far bigger than she had thought. Henry Langford wasn't just a man in a booth, he was a mystery. And now, she was part of whatever came next. The diner had long since gone dark. The open sign flipped backward, and the chairs stacked neatly atop the tables like silent sentinels. Outside, the night air carried a gentle coolness, and the hum of the streetlights overhead gave the quiet street a faint electric pulse. Emma walked beside Henry, their footsteps falling in sync on the cracked sidewalk, as if neither of them was in a hurry to reach the end of the block. The neighborhood was still, the kind of stillness that only comes after midnight, when the city breathes a little softer and secrets feel safe to say out loud. Henry's hands were clasped behind his back, his sweater collar turned up slightly against the breeze. Emma stole glances at him, unsure how to ask the 1,000 questions that buzzed in her chest. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt like an old book waiting to be opened. After a while, without preamble, Henry spoke, his voice low but steady, like he had rehearsed this conversation in his mind 100 times and never found the right moment to say it. My wife loved people like you, real, unpolished, human. She used to say kindness was the rarest currency, that you could build an empire on warmth if you were patient enough. Emma didn't respond right away. She listened, really listened, the way she always had, without interruption or sympathy that felt forced. Henry continued, his eyes focused somewhere ahead, not on the road but on something far older. I built things, beautiful things, hotels where everything was perfect, polished marble, dim lighting. Silence dressed up as elegance, but somewhere along the way I forgot who we were building for. We stopped seeing people, we saw profit. He paused, and his voice caught just slightly. She reminded me, but then she got sick. Fast, unexpected, and when she was gone, so was the reason. I sold everything, disappeared. I didn't want to be found. Emma felt the weight in his words, not as a burden, but as an offering. He wasn't explaining himself. He was inviting her into something sacred. Grief had stripped him of identity, but somehow, sitting at a chipped booth in a diner where the coffee burned and the pie was never the same twice, he had found a flicker of what he lost. Emma spoke softly, almost afraid to disturb the moment. Why now? Why me? Henry finally turned to look at her, and there was no mystery in his eyes. Just clarity. Because you saw me. Not the money. Not the silence. Just me. And you did it without asking for anything back. My wife would have seen you too, and she would have smiled. Emma blinked against the sudden warmth in her chest, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. They reached the corner and stopped beneath a flickering street lamp. Neither speaking, both changed. In that quiet stretch of sidewalk, under the tired hum of the city night, two people with nothing left to prove stood in a peace they didn't know they needed. The apartment was still, wrapped in that in-between quiet that hangs just after midnight, when the city's energy fades into breath and hum and thought. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, the covers rumpled beneath her, and a blank notepad balanced against her knees like a challenge she didn't remember accepting. The lamp on the nightstand cast a pool of yellow light that barely reached the corners of the room, leaving shadows untouched and honest. Her hands were stained with ink, fingers smudged from the pen that lay uncapped beside her, the same pen she had used to scribble 6 false starts and then cross them out with growing frustration. She had tried words like mission and plan and vision, but they felt foreign and hollow in her handwriting. The truth was, She didn't know how to build a future when the past still whispered failure in her ear. The idea of helping Henry rebuild the diner sounded beautiful when spoken aloud under a flickering street lamp, but now, in the stark reality of her tiny room with the peeling paint and the forgotten dishes in the sink, it felt ridiculous. What did she know about leadership? What did she know about business, or blueprints, or managing a team? She was a waitress, a good one, maybe, but not someone you handed the keys to. The notepad stared back at her like a mirror, empty, expectant. Emma reached for her phone with ink-stained fingers and tapped her sister's contact. She didn't expect an answer at this hour, and part of her was glad for it. When the voicemail beeped, her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, but every syllable carried the weight of something she had held in for too long. What if I ruin it? What if I'm just a waitress? Her throat tightened as she said it, the truth of her fear landing heavier than she expected. The silence that followed was longer than the message allowed, so she hung up without another word and set the phone down gently on the nightstand like it might break under the weight of her doubt. Outside, the wind shifted and rustled the blinds just slightly, casting lines of light and shadow across the wall. Emma looked down at her ink-streaked palms, the evidence of her effort staining her skin like a quiet reminder that she had at least tried to start. But trying didn't feel like enough. Not when people were trusting her. Not when someone like Henry Langford had placed something fragile in her hands. Her heart thudded in her chest, not loud but steady, like it was trying to remind her that fear and failure were not the same thing. But in this moment, she couldn't tell the difference. All she could see was the blank page and the whisper in her mind that asked if kindness was really enough to build anything lasting. The sky was still tinted with the last breath of night when Emma pushed open the front door of the diner, the jingling bell overhead breaking the early silence like a soft announcement. Morning light spilled in behind her, painting long golden streaks across the worn linoleum floor. The tables were still bare, the chairs unstacked, the air thick with the scent of yesterday's grease and something older potential. In her hands were several large sheets of butcher paper, rolled and creased from use, corners smudged with graphite and ink, and taped haphazardly where mistakes had been corrected with determination instead of perfection. She had spent the last 2 days sketching and dreaming, fighting past the fear that had once paralyzed her into believing she had nothing to offer. Now, she walked with purpose, each step steady despite the storm of nerves behind her ribs. Henry was already inside, sitting at booth 5 with his usual quiet presence, a cup of coffee resting in front of him untouched. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment he just watched her, curiosity flickering behind the calm steel of his gaze. Emma approached, heart thudding, and gently unrolled the papers across the table between them. There were rough diagrams, notes in the margins, circles drawn in red ink around key ideas. Her voice came out low but clear. "Let's make it more than a diner. Make it a place where people want to be seen. Not just fed, not just served, but noticed, remembered." She pointed to one drawing a reading nook made from salvaged bookshelves. Another showed a long communal table framed by benches, not booths. She had written the words "Pay what you can" in the corner. The drawings weren't professional, but they were full of heart. Emma didn't look up right away. She was afraid of what she might see. But when she finally met Henry's gaze, his eyes were shining, not with disbelief or doubt, but with something rare and full. He reached out and rested his fingers on one of the sketches, tracing a circle where she had written free meals every Sunday for those in need. His voice was barely above a whisper. She would have loved this. Emma knew without asking who he meant. The grief in his eyes was softer now, as though the sharpness had dulled into something useful. Henry sat back slowly, his breath catching just slightly. "You've done something here. Something real," Emma nodded, though the words caught in her throat. For the first time, this place didn't feel like the site of her failure. It felt like the foundation of something honest, something human. She wasn't here to fill orders anymore. She was here to build connection. And as Henry folded up the drawings with care and tucked them under his arm, he looked at her not as someone he had rescued, but as someone he now followed. The midpoint had come, not with applause, not with fanfare, but with blueprints drawn on butcher paper and a vision stitched together with courage. The diner was a mess of exposed beams and torn-up tiles, the scent of sawdust and old grease hanging thick in the air as power tools whined and boots clunked across the floor. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, catching the dust in the air like glitter, but there was nothing magical about the scene. Tables had been pushed to the corners, counters gutted, and the back wall was halfway gone, exposing years of forgotten grime behind the fryer. Emma stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in one hand, sleeves rolled up, her once white sneakers streaked with mud and paint. She had spent the last week breathing life into her vision, but now that the work had truly begun, the cracks started to show. The old staff didn't all come back. Some left quietly, others stayed long enough to judge, and then there was Mike, a short-order cook who had been there longer than the stove he worked on, who stared at her now with folded arms and narrowed eyes as she explained the new floor plan. She pointed to the communal table in the drawing and began talking about open seating and meal-sharing nights when he cut her off. "She's not a boss. She's a server who got lucky." His voice rang through the half-emptied room, louder than any hammer or drill. The construction crew paused. A busser dropped a box of napkin holders with a metallic clatter. Emma froze for a moment, the shame hitting her like a slap, sudden and stinging. The words burrowed deep, unearthing every fear she had kept buried beneath blueprints and borrowed confidence. She looked down at her shoes, then back up, heart thudding loud enough to drown out the silence that followed. Her face flushed, but her spine straightened. She took a slow breath. "You're right," she said evenly, voice steady despite the burn behind her eyes. "I was a server. I worked these floors. I scraped gum from under these tables. I poured coffee for people who didn't look up. But I listened. I learned. And I never forgot what this place feels like to the people who walk in with more weight than money. That's why I'm doing this. Not because I got lucky, because I care." The room stayed quiet for a beat longer, then slowly the workers returned to their tasks, the moment folding itself into the noise again. Mike shook his head but said nothing more, disappearing into the back with muttered frustration. Emma remained still for a second longer, eyes closed briefly before she returned to the clipboard, marking off tasks with a resolve that had taken root and refused to wither. She wasn't here to win their approval. She was here to build something better, and even if it hurt, even if it cost her comfort or reputation, she knew she had to stand her ground, not just for herself, but for what the diner could become. The shelter kitchen smelled of old beans and disinfectant, a mix that clung to the walls and clashed with the quiet dignity of the people seated at the long metal tables. The linoleum was peeling in the corners, the paint on the ceiling cracked like old skin, and the flickering overhead lights gave the entire room a tired yellow hue. Emma stood near the back entrance, out of the way, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her thrifted coat, watching in silence as men and women slowly ate their meals, heads bowed, shoulders hunched not from hunger alone but from the weight of being unseen. No one talked, no one looked around. The air was still and sad, like the room had learned to hold its breath. A man in a threadbare flannel dipped a spoon into a bowl of watery soup and stared at the wall. A woman cradled a paper cup of coffee like it was the last warm thing she had. Emma felt something shift in her chest. Not pity, but purpose. Not sadness, but clarity. She had come here unsure of what she was looking for, her confidence chipped by the rising tension at the diner and the doubts that still echoed after every decision. But here, in this quiet room full of invisible pain, she remembered exactly why she wanted to do this. Later, as she stepped outside into the crisp morning air, she called Henry from the sidewalk, her breath visible in front of her like steam off a boiling pot. When he picked up, she didn't start with small talk. Her voice came through the line with certainty, calm but charged. This is who I want to serve, not the rich, the forgotten, not the ones who can afford another trendy brunch spot. The ones who feel like ghosts, the ones no one sees. Henry was quiet for a moment, and she imagined him sitting at his desk, watching the sun spill through his window like he always did, his silence never empty, always thoughtful. Then he said, "I thought you might say that." Emma didn't smile. It wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment for direction. She turned and looked back at the shelter, the chipped door still slightly ajar. She didn't see weakness. She saw resilience. And it was in that moment, standing on cracked concrete with wind tugging at her scarf, that she understood the real weight of what they were building. It wasn't a diner. It was a haven. A place where no one had to earn warmth, where presence was payment enough. The mission had never been about food. It was about belonging. And for the first time, she wasn't just reacting to her own pain. She was stepping into something bigger than herself. The line outside the diner stretched down the block before the sun had even cleared the rooftops, a ripple of anticipation that buzzed through the chilly morning air like static. Word had spread fast, free meals, pay what you can, no questions asked, and the community responded not with curiosity, but with hunger. Hunger for food, yes, but also for warmth, for dignity, for proof that somewhere still existed a place that saw them. Inside, the air was thick with movement. The kitchen hissed and clanged with the sound of too many orders at once, the fryer bubbling wildly, the griddle smoking under piles of eggs and potatoes. Staff moved like a barely contained tide, bumping into one another, shouting over the noise, trying to keep up with the chaos unfolding around them. Emma was everywhere at once, refilling coffee, wiping down counters, taking orders, carrying trays, her once crisp white shirt now speckled with grease and sweat. Her hair stuck to her forehead, her hands red from heat, her voice hoarse from answering questions that kept coming like waves. At the pass, a plate crashed to the floor. She turned instinctively to help, grabbed a hot tray without thinking, and hissed as the metal seared into the soft skin of her palm. She stumbled back, cradling her hand, the pain sharp and immediate, but even through the shock, she saw the panic ripple across the kitchen. The young line cook froze, A busser stared wide-eyed. The entire rhythm of the room threatened to fall apart in that 1 second, but Emma straightened, jaw tight, breath shaky, and raised her other hand. "I'm fine. Keep going." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear, firm, a signal that this was not the moment to fall apart. She wrapped her hand in a towel and kept moving. The staff watched her for a moment, then slowly returned to their tasks, a new steadiness forming in their steps. She took another order with her left hand, smiling through the burn, sweat trailing down the back of her neck. The tables were full now, and the noise had grown into a kind of music laughter, clinking cutlery, the shuffle of coats being removed and conversations being started. For all its chaos, something real was happening. People were connecting. No one was rushing. No one was judging. Emma's hand throbbed with every step, but she barely noticed anymore. She was in the thick of it, leading not from a distance, but from the middle, from within. There was no corner office, no detachment, just grit and sweat and burned hands and heart, and as she moved through the whirlwind, she knew something important had just been proven, not to the customers, not even to the staff, but to herself. She could do this, not perfectly, not without pain, but honestly, fully. The soft opening wasn't soft at all. It was loud, messy, beautiful, and it was only the beginning. The office smelled of old paper and lemon cleaner, the same scent that had lingered since before the renovations, clinging to the filing cabinets and the baseboards like a memory that refused to be wiped away. Emma stepped inside, still riding the adrenaline from the soft opening's whirlwind of motion, expecting to find Henry at the desk reviewing receipts or sketching out ideas on a napkin like he had every morning that week. But the chair was empty, the desk cleared, and the only thing left behind was a single envelope placed neatly in the center, her name handwritten in slow, careful strokes. She stared at it for a moment, heart tapping a little faster in her chest, as if it already knew the shape of what was coming. She tore it open with shaking fingers, unfolded the page, and read the words that seemed to land like bricks in her stomach. "You don't need me anymore. You never did. This place is yours now." The rest of the letter was brief, a few lines about belief and pride, something about knowing when to step aside. But the final sentence burned the brightest. "I was only ever meant to remind you of what you already are." Emma sank slowly into the chair, the letter trembling in her hand, her burned palm now wrapped in gauze that itched with every movement. The room spun just slightly as her breath caught in her throat. He was gone, just like that. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. The man who had appeared out of nowhere, bought the diner, and handed her a dream was now a ghost in ink on paper. She read the letter again, as if it might change the second time. But the message didn't soften, it only sank deeper. Panic rose quickly, sharp and hot. What was she supposed to do without him? He had been the anchor, the voice of reason, the one who understood the weight of what they were trying to build. She felt betrayal prick at her skin like cold air. After everything, how could he leave now? When the foundation was still wet, when she still questioned herself every morning, when she hadn't even figured out payroll. The walls of the office suddenly felt too close, the quiet pressing in, reminding her of the apartment that once swallowed her grief in silence. She looked down at the letter one more time, her eyes blurring. "You never did." That line echoed louder than the rest. She wanted to scream, to call him, to demand answers, but there was no number, no return address. just empty space where his guidance used to be. For the first time since this all began, Emma felt completely alone again. The weight of leadership, of expectation, of everything they had built together now sat squarely on her shoulders without the steady presence she had come to rely on. The man who had believed in her had vanished, and she wasn't sure if she could still believe in herself. Rain tapped gently against the wide front windows of the diner, each drop tracing slow, meandering paths down the glass, like quiet reminders that the world outside kept moving, no matter how stuck she felt inside. The breakfast rush had ended hours ago, and the lunch crowd hadn't yet begun, leaving the diner in a rare and peaceful stillness. But Emma wasn't at peace. She sat alone in a corner booth, her back pressed against the vinyl, arms folded tight across her chest, eyes unfocused as they followed the rhythm of the rain. A half-empty mug of coffee sat in front of her, the steam long gone, its warmth fading just like her confidence. The letter from Henry had been folded and unfolded so many times it now looked older than it was, the creases worn thin at the edges, as though holding it tighter might make him come back. But he wouldn't. She knew that now. He had stepped away without warning, without instruction, leaving her with a vision and a building full of expectations that suddenly felt too big for her hands. In the quiet, her thoughts drifted backward, farther than Henry, farther than the renovations, to a memory that arrived uninvited but sharp, her first day at the diner, years ago. She had walked through that same front door soaking wet from a storm not unlike this one, clutching a cheap purse with one torn strap and everything she owned packed into a car that barely ran. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. She had lied on the application, said she had experience. Rita had seen through it immediately but hired her anyway, probably because no one else showed up for the late shift. That first night, she had spilled coffee on a customer and cried in the back room, but she had stayed, night after night, because she needed the money, because she needed something to belong to, and slowly, over time, the place had stopped feeling like a job and started feeling like a heartbeat, a rhythm, a home. Now, looking around the same space she once scrubbed floors in, Emma felt that same weight she had carried on her first day, the fear of being seen as not enough, of being a fraud, of not deserving the chance she'd been given. The difference now was that more people were watching, waiting, depending on her. She traced her finger along a small scratch in the table's surface, one she remembered making herself years ago when her tray had slammed down too hard. So much had changed. Yet here she was again, still alone, still unsure, still wondering if she could ever be more than a girl who got lucky with kindness. The rain fell harder, a steady percussion against the glass. She didn't cry. Not this time. The sadness didn't scream. It sat quietly beside her, a familiar companion whispering doubts she thought she had buried. But deep beneath that quiet despair, something still pulsed. A small, stubborn thread that reminded her she had been here before and gotten back up. The mail had piled up by the front door like it always did after a long week, the usual stack of coupons, unpaid invoices, and envelopes with windows that meant stress. Emma barely glanced at it as she stepped into the diner that morning, her coat damp from the misting rain, her thoughts still tangled in the weight of yesterday's doubt. The place was quiet again, the staff not due for another hour, and the smell of fresh paint still lingered faintly beneath the aroma of coffee she'd just brewed for herself. She dropped her keys on the counter, the jingle echoing louder than it should have, and reached absently for the mail, sorting through it with the numbness of routine. But one envelope stopped her. No return address. Heavy paper. Her name handwritten in the same careful, old-fashioned script she had seen once before. Her breath caught. She didn't open it right away. She stared at it, sensing something final in its weight, something important. Finally, with slow, deliberate fingers, she peeled it open, heart pounding like a drum far off in the fog. Inside was a folded legal document, crisp and precise, the deed to the diner. Her name printed clearly at the top, sole owner. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the second piece of paper. A short, handwritten note, no more than a few lines. You gave this place life, now give it a legacy. That was all it said. No signature. None was needed. She lowered the papers slowly, her fingers tightening around their edges like they might float away if she wasn't careful. The silence of the room deepened. Her knees touched the edge of the counter, and she leaned back slightly, needing its weight to hold her steady. The diner, this place where she had once asked for a chance, where she had scraped gum off tables and poured coffee for strangers just to keep the lights on, was now hers. Not leased, not borrowed, hers. She blinked once, twice. A wave of emotion surged so suddenly it stole her breath. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. Shock, humility, a kind of reverence that came with understanding the depth of what she'd been given. Henry was truly gone now, but his final act wasn't abandonment. It was belief. It was a torch passed. It was trust, not just in her ideas, but in her heart, her vision, her leadership. Emma pressed the letter to her chest for a moment, eyes stinging with the tears she hadn't let fall in days. She exhaled slowly, grounding herself in the reality of it. This wasn't a dream. It wasn't a fantasy. It was hers. The walls, the booths, the soul of the place. It had started with kindness, and now, with trembling hands and a letter she'd never forget, she was ready to turn that kindness into something lasting, something no one could take from her. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and nervous anticipation, the stainless steel counters polished and cleared for the first staff meeting since the soft opening. Pans hung neatly above the prep station, gleaming in the early light filtering through the back windows. Staff trickled in one by one, wiping hands on aprons, trading uncertain glances, the air tense with expectation. Emma stood at the center, not behind the counter, not off to the side, but in front, where every eye could see her. A clipboard rested on the counter beside her, but she didn't hold it. Today, she didn't need props or permission. Her heart beat fast, but her voice was steady as she looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. The dishwasher with arms crossed, the cook who had once questioned her right to lead, the hostess who had silently stayed through it all. Emma took a breath and began. I need to say something first. I didn't do everything right. I moved fast. I didn't listen enough. I tried to prove I belonged, and in doing that, I forgot this place belongs to all of us. A silence followed. Not cold, just waiting. She let it settle before continuing, her voice warmer now, more sure. This isn't about me, it's about us. What we're building here isn't just a diner. It's a place where kindness isn't optional, where food isn't just served, it's shared, where we see the people who walk through that door really see them, and remind them they matter. Her eyes drifted to the prep board, where daily specials used to be scribbled in haste. "From now on," she said, "we plan meals not just by ingredients, but by impact. No one leaves hungry. No one gets turned away." The cook who once called her lucky raised an eyebrow, arms slowly unfolding. Someone in the back let out a quiet, "Yeah." Emma took a step forward. "I'm not here to be the boss. I'm here to lead beside you. I want your ideas, your experience, your honesty. If we do this together, this place won't just survive. It'll matter, truly matter, for us, for the neighborhood, for everyone who's ever felt invisible." The room stayed quiet for a moment longer, but it was a different kind of quiet now, thick with understanding, with the weight of something real. Then someone clapped, just once, then again, and soon the room filled with the sound of hands coming together, not loud or wild, but steady, certain, unity. Emma smiled, her chest tightening with something that felt like redemption. She had made mistakes, but she had returned. Not just with ownership papers, but with a heart wide open and a vision big enough to share. The diner was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them now. And together, they would make it more than a business. They would make it a home. The diner pulsed with a new kind of energy, the kind that hummed beneath the clink of silverware and the soft strumming of guitar from a musician perched near the window. Laughter floated through the air like a warm current, mixing with the smell of cinnamon pancakes and fresh brewed coffee. The walls had changed. What was once cracked beige paint now held a mural that stretched from floor to ceiling, painted by a local artist who had once eaten here alone every Sunday. The mural showed hands passing bread, faces smiling, a sunrise blooming over a table filled with people of every kind. Underneath it, in careful script, were the words, "Everyone belongs here." In one corner, a shelf overflowed with donated books, most of them dog-eared and well-loved. A group of kids huddled there now, legs tucked beneath them on a faded rug, whispering and laughing as they flipped through stories. The register rang softly from time to time, but the amounts were never the same. Some customers dropped folded bills into the jar labeled "Pay What You Can." Others left IOUs. A few left nothing but a thank you. No one was turned away. A man in a work uniform handed his last few coins to the hostess with an apologetic smile. She waved him off and pointed to an empty booth. Sit, eat, rest. That was the rule now. Emma stood near the back wall, a towel slung over her shoulder, her shirt wrinkled, a smudge of flour across one arm. But her smile was soft and steady as she watched it all unfold. The chaos of the soft opening felt like a distant memory now. The tension, the fear, the doubt, all had been replaced by something stronger, a rhythm of kindness, a space that gave instead of took. Henry's letter lived in her coat pocket, folded and worn from rereading. "You gave this place life. Now give it a legacy." Those words echoed in her chest now as she watched a young man refill a stranger's coffee and an older woman offer a child a book from the shelf. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place to be seen, to breathe, to heal. Emma exhaled slowly, not with exhaustion, with peace. For the first time in a long time, everything felt still, not empty, full, alive. She had doubted herself. She had almost walked away, but she had stayed, and because she did, Something beautiful had taken root, not perfect, but real. She wiped her hands on the towel and stepped forward. There were still tables to clean, still stories unfolding in every booth, and in the center of it all was her. No longer just a server, not just the owner, but the heart of a place that remembered people who were too often forgotten. The soft chime of the front door bell barely rose above the low hum of conversation and the gentle clatter of plates, but Emma heard it all the same. Something in her stilled. She turned from the counter instinctively, heart quickening not with panic, but with something quieter. And there he was, Henry Langford, wearing that same worn sweater, a little thinner maybe, a little older in the eyes, but unmistakably him. He made no announcement, no sweeping entrance, just walked slowly to booth 5, the same seat he had occupied months ago, before the mural, before the bookshelves, before the place had found its heartbeat again. He slid into the booth and rested his hands on the table like he had never left. Emma didn't rush. She didn't speak. She picked up the coffee pot and crossed the diner at a steady pace, the sound of her footsteps barely audible over the music and laughter filling the room. When she reached him, she didn't ask if he wanted coffee. She simply poured. The steam rose between them, and she set the pot down gently. Her eyes met his. No apology, no explanation. Just presence. Henry looked around slowly, at the mural. The shelves, the families sharing pancakes, the man in the corner playing quiet guitar. His eyes softened, and he nodded once. "Looks like you made something special." Emma felt the words land with warmth instead of weight. She let the silence hold for a moment before answering, her voice steady. "No, we did." Henry smiled, not wide, but real. The kind that says everything without trying. For a long moment, they said nothing else. There was no need. Everything they had hoped for, everything they had fought for, now lived in the space around them. In the way a child reached across the table to share her toast. In the quiet way someone paid for a stranger's meal and walked away without a word. In the way no one here felt invisible. Booth 5, once a quiet place of hiding, was now part of something bigger. A corner of belonging. Henry picked up his coffee, sipped it, and said nothing more. Emma stood for a second longer, then gave him a small nod before turning to help a customer waiting near the register. The moment had passed, but something deep had settled. Not just closure, respect. A full circle drawn without fanfare. He had come back, not to reclaim anything, but to witness what she had built, what they had built. And in that simple return, the story turned its final page with quiet grace. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow across the diner floor, slanting through the front windows and turning dust motes into floating gold. The rush had just passed, leaving behind the soft clink of dishes and the low murmur of conversation. At the end of the counter stood a girl no older than 19, shoulders hunched slightly, hands fidgeting with the hem of her borrowed apron. Her name was Marisol. It was her first day. Her shoes were too new, her voice too quiet, and her eyes held that familiar wide uncertainty that Emma knew all too well. The look of someone unsure if they belonged. Emma approached slowly, towel tossed over one shoulder, a faint smile pulling at her lips. She recognized the posture, the fear, the weight of not wanting to mess up. Years ago, that had been her. Lost and waiting for someone to tell her she could stay. Marisol dropped a napkin holder while trying to set up a table and winced as it clattered to the floor. Emma bent to pick it up with her and handed it back without comment, only warmth in her eyes. "You're doing fine," she said gently. Marisol nodded, biting her lip. "Sorry, I've never done anything like this before." Emma tilted her head slightly, smile deepening. "Neither had I." Marisol looked up, blinking. "Really?" Emma nodded. "First day I walked in here, I spilled coffee on a customer and cried in the back. Thought I'd be fired before lunch." Marisol laughed, a short, nervous sound, but it eased something in her shoulders. Emma leaned in slightly, voice low and kind. "Just be yourself. People remember kindness, not perfection, not speed, just how you made them feel. That's what stays." Marisol looked at her, eyes softening. "Okay, I'll try." Emma gave her a reassuring pat on the arm. "That's all any of us ever do. Try." And then she stepped back, letting the girl find her rhythm. She watched from across the room as Marisol approached her next table, still nervous but now with a little more steadiness in her step, a little more belief. Emma turned to refill coffee cups and answer a question about the pay-what-you-can policy, but something in her heart had shifted. She no longer carried the weight of needing to prove she belonged. That season had passed. She was no longer the girl hoping someone would see her. She had become the one who noticed, who steadied, who passed the torch. Watching Marisol fumble through her first orders with flushed cheeks and determination, Emma saw her younger self not as a wound but as a beginning. The cycle was continuing, the kindness was still growing. The diner was doing what it was meant to do, not just serve food, but nurture people. Emma smiled to herself as the room buzzed around her. The legacy had already begun. The evening settled softly over the city, the sky a deep navy curtain pulled tight behind the glowing pink and blue of the diner's neon sign. Rain began to fall, slow and steady, tapping against the windows like a quiet rhythm only the heart could hear. Inside, the diner had thinned to a few lingering tables. An elderly couple sharing pie, a young man hunched over a laptop, a child asleep against their mother's shoulder. The warm light inside glowed golden against the storm outside, casting long reflections on the wet pavement. Emma sat alone near the front window, a leather-bound journal open in her lap, her pen moving slowly across the page. Her hair was pulled back, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands still faintly stained with the smudges of a full day's work. She paused between sentences to watch the rain trail down the glass, her eyes full but peaceful. Behind her, the soft sounds of the diner continued. Coffee pouring, silverware clinking, someone humming low along to the jukebox. Everything was in motion, and yet everything felt still. A voice carried over the quiet, not spoken aloud but felt like a truth landing deep. "They fired me for being too kind, so I built a place where kindness is the job." The camera of the heart panned wide, showing the mural now complete, showing the books in the corner worn from use, showing the new girl laughing as she balanced too many plates and someone catching them for her just in time. It showed the man in the corner tuning his guitar, the community table crowded with strangers who now spoke like friends, the pay-what-you-can jar still half full. It showed the life that had bloomed where once there had only been routine. Emma's pen came to a stop. She closed the journal slowly and exhaled as she looked out once more at the rain. This place had once been the scene of her lowest moment. Now it stood as a testament to what happens when someone chooses not to shrink after rejection, but to grow, not in spite of it, because of it. The diner glowed in the dark, not just from neon lights or warm bulbs, but from the inside out. Emma rose from the booth, tucking the journal under her arm. She walked back toward the kitchen with her head high, her steps sure. Kindness had always been her strength, now it was her legacy. And the diner was proof that even the softest hearts could build something that lasts. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that quiet kindness can echo louder than any title, then take a moment to share it. Leave a comment below and tell us what part stayed with you. Give this video a like so we know these stories matter, and if you want more journeys like Emma's, stories that begin with doubt and end in something beautifully human, make sure to subscribe and tap the notification bell. Someone out there is wondering if being soft means being weak. Send this to them. Because sometimes all it takes is one person who listens, one stranger who sees you, or one booth in a corner diner to change everything. Thank you for being part of this one.